Ein Jahr kein Sex oder ein Jahr kein Zocken?
See Souls in 76?
Ooh, self-burn. Those are rare.
But are they though? So I reckon self-deprecation can be a pretty funny thing. We see it all over this generation raised by the internet. In our music, TV, away from the screens. It can be used in so many different contexts. Like, it's such a laid-back, versatile technique. For the longest time, many comedians have been able to build a successful brand on the foundations of self-deprecation.
Like that?
Who's laughing? Who's laughing? This is a circle of trust. We support each other as a team. That's what the Swans are all about.
Or maybe it's just exclusively a British thing.
Still stunning. Basically a scrotum.
Do you know what? I don't mean this in a way that is sort of self-pitying. I've always assumed people don't need me as a friend. I don't have it's not sort of an insecurity. I just think people can survive without me. They don't need me in their life.
As if to be British means to have it inherently exist within you. Hey, imagine that, huh? But a little closer to home, where we can use it to gain a more down-to-earth, first impression. It's like if you're meeting someone for the first time, it just creates this, endearing image of them inside you. Like, hey, I love this guy. He's so modest and humble, not arrogant at all. Allows you to, relate on common ground. It's good fun. But what if it goes a little something like this? Now, I've found myself in many situations where someone I care about and have a great deal of respect for probably take it a little too far in their own, self-burn. I was all oh man, are you really okay? Bro, I love you. Don't look down on yourself like that. It's I wish you'd put the focus on the positives that I see you for instead of hyper-focusing on your own negatives. And then they say things like, oh, relax, I'm just joking. You don't have to worry about me. I'm fine. Honestly. It's yeah, I don't know. That seemed like it was coming from a place of pain. The thing is, we never know. They may or may not be joking. But let's say that it was coming from a place of negativity. A dark place. It hurts to hear that someone you care about thinks of themselves that way. And that's where we'll get into the real video. So, self-deprecation. Widely understood within psychology and pop culture as any statement or actions conveying a negative self-evaluation with implications of a belittling, undervaluing, and critical nature of oneself. So, when it crosses into that territory where it's most likely not a joke, that unhealthy, self-sabotaging tendency underlying of a mental illness. It reminded me of this TED Talk I saw, where he describes depression as this form of darkness that hugs you and reminds you that you're alone, that this is where you're meant to be. And I thought that even though self-deprecation and depression are two separate things, they're not without overlap. Such is the nature of mental illness. So with that in mind, is it a similar case for these people who engage in this excessive self-deprecation? Do they see themselves as these people not of an equal plane with others? That this dark place is where they feel they belong, one of a lesser existence and undeserving of good things? What is this comfort they find in it? Because we know that when we're in a panic state, we're not truly ourselves. When the spotlight shines, it just makes you so uncomfortable. And without any clear thinking, you retreat to self-deprecation as this defense mechanism. You just want that burning light off at all costs. One could argue that, that's just a fight or flight response. And they're not wrong. Looking at the bare bones of it, it probably is. But, why self-deprecation? Why the negative self-view? What makes it this automatic, almost immediate response, like it's a built-in negative factory setting we default to in our most vulnerable of times. Because it can get so frustrating when you're aware of it, vow to never do it, but when that spotlight shines, you retreat to it once again. And then all you're left with is just this feeling of disappointment at your lack of self-respect. When something can't simply be overpowered through like thoughts and words, when we lose ourselves to this fight or flight response, that to me tells me that it's deeper than the surface. And so like I wanted to, find out why, because I know I'm not the only one who goes through this sort of stuff. Where does it originate from? Like this inescapable, at times infuriating personality trait of self-deprecation. And after research, it was far more apparent that self-deprecation didn't occur on its own. It was only one part of a bigger mental health picture. And that picture being two heavily intertwined occurrences of depression and low self-esteem. Now, depression is pretty self-explanatory, but self-esteem is defined as a complex construct that exists across many domains, representing the affective and evaluative component of self-concept. With low self-esteem, somebody expresses feelings that they are unworthy as a person, that they're not good enough. Whereas with high self-esteem, someone expresses that they are a person of worth, that they are good enough, yet not in a way that is superior to others. So in any case, the best way I can describe the affective component is that it's something that's predominantly molded by past events. If someone has a history of success, then that would mold a more positive affective component, which equates to high self-esteem and confidence in one's own abilities. If someone has more of a history of failure, then that would mold a more negative affective component and consequently low self-esteem. For example, in a social domain. Now, let's say you've had a history of successful interactions and you're able to connect quite well with other people. You've got thought-provoking conversation, good one-liners, and good laughs. So that success is going to get backed up in your affective state and radiate as this confidence, adaptable in any social circumstance. Now, on the opposite end, someone with low self-esteem trying to function in a social domain would be more along the lines of awkward silence, freezing up, or even verbal diarrhea. And so, stem from these previous, failures, if you want to call them that, the very thought of a social situation sends like a wave of dread throughout the body. And I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but the main hallmark of an affective state is that it's not something that can be simply controlled by words or thoughts alone. If you've ever felt like you've lost yourself to this overwhelming emotion, and then tried to counter it through self-talk or repetition, but you just can't seem to get through to overpower the fear, that anxiety, or that dread, then that's a classic example of the affective component taking over. Whether it's positive or negative, it is largely reinforced by past actions and acts as this greater force from beneath the surface. And that surface being the evaluative component, the second part of the definition. Now, you may have heard professionals refer to it as the prefrontal cortex or higher cognition or executive function, something technical like that. But regardless, it's how we realistically apply logic to try and make sense of all the emotions within. Our affective is essentially filtered through to our evaluative state. So it ultimately decides whether we engage or don't engage in things like social interaction. And like all aspects of the mind, it's not a binary system that operates systematically. The affective can often be more dominant than the evaluative, whilst the evaluative still maintains the final say. And if the end result is an unfavourable one, then that's when we use terms like, it was a lack of judgment, where our evaluative failed to foresee the mistake influenced by the affective. So if the evaluative is constantly filtering the negativity of past events, failures, and the byproducts that come with it, then there's a good chance that negativity can corrupt the evaluative, where everything is immediately interpreted through a negative lens. And if this negative is constantly allowed to feed back and forth in this never-ending cycle without being checked, then there's a pretty good chance that could lead to depression-related low self-esteem. I'm sure everyone has dealt with failure and rejection at some point in their lives. Considering how people respond, it could actually help boost their self-esteem. But at what point does it become more demoralizing than it does opportunistic and really start to infest the self-esteem? Well, that's where you'd have to consider the significance of the event, be it failure or something even more traumatic. Now, Melanie Fennell, a renowned clinical psychologist, believed that low self-esteem was actually a learned pattern. In her cognitive model, she states that early life events and temperament would establish negative core beliefs about the self, which lead to dysfunctional assumptions. This belief system can be activated by critical incidents, so the person will believe that they might not be able to meet the requirements of their assumptions, which in turn will lead to negative predictions, anxiety, and maladaptive behavior. To name a few. And so, what Fennell labels as critical incidents, I'd imagine, are events so significant it leaves a lasting impression that changes the very makeup of our affective state. Because when are we most vulnerable, most impressionable? As children. There's no shortage of evidence that suggests childhood trauma plays such a huge role when shaping, everything. Especially the affective and evaluative states. If you've heard the saying, children are like little sponges, in that their developing brains can soak up any idea around them and leave its mark in a permanent manner. So, by definition, if a negative critical incident were to occur, as Fennell suggests, then it would activate this negative belief system of dysfunctional assumptions. The same dysfunctional assumptions Jake speaks about in his video. Now, Fennell's model was based off a number of Aaron Beck's theories. One of them being his theories of negative self-schemata. He stated that a depressed person will, often from childhood experiences, hold a negative self-schema originating from negative early experiences. With this, people are more liable to interpret information around them in a negative manner. And that was the next point I wanted to cover, because what he labels as a negative early experience is essentially the equivalent to what Fennell labels a critical incident, where criticism, abuse, and bullying are the main three. Now, in the research I looked at, it predominantly covered criticism and how that, as a traumatic event, would result in higher levels of self-deprecation, low self-worth, and negative interpretation. And you could probably argue that abuse and bullying have even more devastating effects than criticism. But I believe the nature of those two are so widespread and complex that they probably deserve their own video in the future. So, criticism. Now, I understand that every child is different. Some are actually able to respond quite well to it. But for many of those who don't, criticism can come from basically anyone. Whether it's an authority figure or that out-of-touch aunt or uncle. But when it comes from the most influential figure in a child's life, the parents, then the significance of that can be very consequential. I'm sure we're familiar with the prototype tiger parent and their style of discipline. We need only see a few examples of this critical and abusive style to see how much of a toll it can actually take as the child grows up. Whether that's developing an inferiority complex, or a fractured emotional relationship, or even in the most tragic and extreme cases, pushed to a psychotic breakdown. Now, this dynamic of the tiger parent was actually covered by a subsection in the study. They didn't specifically use the term, but they did have a look at 471 adolescent students and how they coped with a number of demands relating to academic stress. So they did this using the Rosenberg scale, and they looked at the students' perceived level of self-worth and self-deprecation to analyze overall self-esteem. And we can see common trends in the mindset of students with a negative affective state. And this is potentially owing to the negative experiences of their childhood trauma. They were more likely to think less of themselves and engage in self-deprecative thoughts. So the students with high levels of self-deprecation and lower levels of self-worth reported a relationship with their parents that was more critical in nature. They definitely felt their parents were more focused on their performance as opposed to their well-being. And unfortunately, this concept isn't limited to academics. It can be applied to any domain where parents force excessive emphasis on achievement. It's almost not uncommon that they attribute this twisted sense of love to the external outcome of success. And the child sponge, I guess we'll refer to them as, not knowing how messed up that is for the parents to do, in some way justify it in their head. It becomes like this do or die. To succeed means praise and approval, a parent's love, which the child is everything. To fail means disappointment, punishment, verbal, even emotional abuse. And I've seen parents adopt some real petty and horrible behaviors regarding emotional abuse. Overtly expressing distress at your child's challenges is a burden that should not fall upon them. That is very heavy. So when putting all the pieces together, it sort of makes sense as to where this low self-esteem and depression potentially originated. How all this negativity conceived early on molds the affective state, hardening over time, these people becoming set in their ways to look at themselves with this distorted lens. Now, again, not to be all doom and gloom, because a lot of people have flourished in an upbringing of adversity. I'm aware of the pressure makes diamonds mentality. And also, this isn't me saying that parents shouldn't push their children to be the best they can be or overcompensate and enable them without consequences, because that can lead to a set of entirely different issues that I'm not going to cover in this video. But yeah, it's just that I think it can be done without this underlying sense of pressure, it's this do or die. Because in the study, the parents who actually showed an interest in their children's well-being, as opposed to just academic performance, asking them if there was any difficulty in school life or how their friendships were, these parents were better able to attain their children's happiness and an affective state more positively tuned, with thoughts like, I like challenging homework to learn new things, instead of thoughts like, I study so my parents won't criticize me. So it can really give us an appreciation, the positive impact parenting behaviors can have from a multi-level perspective. It can act as a catalyst or a decisive moment in how the child's self-esteem progresses. Do you enforce in their affective state, a resilient mindset, one where they fall to get back up and give it another shot, or one that's coming from this place of threat, so traumatized by fear of failure, it eventually becomes this unwillingness to try. I'm pretty sure I know which one I'd prefer. So, knowing what we know, where do I intend to take the rest of this video? Because when someone points to past trauma as a likely cause of a mental disorder, it's sort of oh, thanks for bringing that up. You gonna build me a time machine now? Or knowing what it is one thing, but taking steps to recovery so that it doesn't dictate your life is generally where we want to get. Now, obviously, I'm not a licensed mental health service, nor am I a substitute for medical advice. But if you decide to go down the road of reaching out to someone, now, just before I sound too preachy, can I just say, as someone who has spoken to a counsellor, I feel it definitely does help.
Oh shit, Professor, you're right!
Their professionalism and just that care that comes naturally to them to help you break out of your dysfunctional beliefs and realize, hey, maybe this actually isn't where I belong. I know every child, every person has a natural aptitude towards something. No one should be made to feel like they're unworthy their whole life just because they weren't good at something they were pushed into. As the age-old quote goes, everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. We've seen so many people share their story of childhood adversity. And whilst vicarious motivation and inspiration can be a bit...
Stay hard!
I ask that you humour me because I don't want to sound overly idealistic or neglect the impact people's childhood have on them. But maybe it can help us realise that at one point or another, someone out there has had the same experience as us, felt the same way. And although we may not escape it entirely, we've found something to work towards, a purpose we enjoy. You're not alone in all this, as isolating as it must have felt all those years ago. You're definitely not alone. As someone who has battled internally, with seeking help, I'd like to think that I can understand, to an extent, those who feel this wave of hesitance, whether it be your pride, seeing one is almost like a hit to your character, or fear and anxiety that they might downplay your issues or carelessly prescribe medication. And then there's just always that added social anxiety about opening up to a stranger about such personal things. Sometimes we might worry what they'll think, or even whether they'll judge us. But not only are they experts at not judging, they have this transcendent knowledge that our, issues are that of a mental disorder. It may need some work and attention, but it doesn't define who we are. Yeah, but despite all that, having dabbled in all these thoughts throughout my long journey of life, personally, I see it as a very normal thing. As normal as seeing the doctor when you have the flu. You have something that interrupts your quality of life. So you want to get on top of it so that you can continue to live your life free of that interruption. So even though purely from a progress perspective, it can help, I understand there are still so many depths to our psychology as to why it's so difficult. Even with the mental health advocates of today, the stigma still casts a heavy shadow. No matter what, it just doesn't change the fact that seeing one or seeking professional help is still such a difficult thing to do. So then, is seeing a therapist or a psychologist really necessary? Well, I can't speak for others, but I also understand that it's not a must if you want to get better. I've known many people who've successfully taken their own mental health in their own hands. And these people generally have a good level of self-awareness, structure, and arguably most important of all, a trusted support network. And that acts as a pretty good lead into the final part of the study that I wanted to cover. The author labelled it social bonding capital. Now, despite it sounding like something out of a tax return, it's actually far from it. So it's described as inward-looking bonds, relationships, networks centered on trust and interrelations which link within groups. It can be found in emotionally close and tightly knit relationships like family and close friends. So, those in their heart of hearts who genuinely care about you. And so the students who felt they were in this more socially supportive environment actually expressed greater levels of self-esteem and lower levels of self-deprecation. They would say things like, my friends are with me when I'm lonely or going through a hard time, or my friends help me when I need help. So yeah, this concept of, social bonding capital, no matter how you want to phrase it or recognize it, it's probably not new, or it's probably common knowledge, but it's nice to know that something that's a bit more familiar and not so formal actually is proven to help. In this day and age where mental health so commonly falls to the wayside, anything that can get you on the path of improvement is definitely a good thing. So I think it's important for me to end it on this point. Again, thank you for making it this far. I promise I'm working on a method to shorten my videos. But yeah, until then. If you found that you're able to relate to what I've covered, maybe not on all points, and maybe perhaps not the severity of what I've spoken about, but if the result of it has left you feeling that you belong in this dark place, you live with the guilt of what you couldn't be, and it's pushed you to a point where you see yourself as this lesser existence, you feel like you're undeserving of kindness and help from others. You might even like reject it, as if it is like your repentance to stay in this dark place for the mistakes you've made. The if you knew the real me complex, you know, the burden I am, the mistakes I've made, how many people I've failed. Like, if that is your line of thinking, like can I try to like change your mind? Now, I don't want to make it out to be so simple, you know, the burdens of our past and our guilt, like they really are. But bottom line, like that can be classified as a dysfunctional belief, and a very common one at that, like manifested from the negative affective state I mentioned earlier. Like, it's not your fault that you were born to parents who may or may not have had your best interest at heart, but they did it in such a way that caused lasting trauma. Or if you were born into an abusive family, or went to a school unable to provide the right support for your needs. We don't choose our family or the environment we grow up in. Now, I know it's mighty convenient to blame things like out of our control and like make excuses, but like that's not what I'm doing here. Like, I'm not making excuses. How could you ever hold a child accountable for the flaws of those who are meant to know better? Like, there's no way. But the reality of that, like, is so cruel that even though you're not at fault, you're the one who suffers the consequences. Now, I'm going to try to say this in the most sincere, like, non-Hollywoody way possible. But it's because you were born into this world that you take it upon yourself to heal. Like, you deserve to live a life you're proud of. And if you have been pushed so far to the point of suicide ideation, like, first of all, like, I'm so like sorry that's happened to you. But you definitely don't deserve to die for it. Like, I know how unreasonable it is for me to say this stuff from behind a screen. But like, I do 100% believe in that. These things can be so hard to confront. Like, what could you have done that you don't feel that you deserve another chance to forgive yourself and fight every day? Like, let your parents down? Well, like I've done that. You know, like fail time and time again. Like, bro, like I've done that too. You know, like so ashamed of your mistakes, like you'll feel that you'll never live it down. Like, bro, like been there. Like, I'm 3 from 3. You know, like, I've made a lot of mistakes that I regret, but I'm like still here fighting every day because, you know, life's fucking good. Like, even with all the burdens we carry, like, it's so good. So yeah, that's what I want to be here for. If you're scared or anxious or tired, you feel lost, or like you just can't. Like, I won't have all the answers, but maybe I can sort of be like that first step to remind you that you're not alone in all this. Especially since I know what it's like to not be ready, you know, despite knowing the solution. You know, sometimes you just feel so tired, like your willpower is like paralyzed. Like, maybe all you need to get it going is, you know, someone to try to understand your circumstances a bit more, instead of telling you what to do. Because that's what I want my channel to be. You know, I'm definitely not going to be the most streamlined approach or what everyone is looking for. But maybe it's what some people need. You know, in this era where we feel like life is just moving by so quickly. Like, you know, like, probably won't be a motivator of the masses, but rather that guy who's got your back, even if he's a bit of an airhead. So yeah, you can find a sense of community here. Because if it can help ease even the slightest of burdens, that can then help you move towards that first step of improvement. And I'll say, like, oh yeah, like, let's do it. You know? Got your back all the way. Like, you fucking got this. Anyway, yeah, do your best. Love ya.
I love you all. I don't give a hate me. I still love you.